So I spent about an hour on Friday cutting up these bits of foam into blocks, and the idea being that I just show you a couple of things about how to put them together as a model. So basically using bandsaw, really, because there's a lot of these cuts with just pieces chopped out with the bandsaw, such as like here, straight cuts, and then use the small disc sander to round off these edges here and here, just being very gentle, because obviously the foam is hard, but it's not hard enough to withstand a lot of pressure on the disc sander, things like that. So yeah, basic shapes, cut up with the bandsaw, holes drilled in, and this one was with the bobbin sander here, and you know, just getting your basic shapes really. A lot of the shaping you're going to do will come from using the hand tools, and this is where your model plan is really important to kind of work out when you make the model, like where you want the cuts, where the holes are going to be for details like screws. You're going to put in screws to make it look realistic, and sometimes what you might do when you're making things is you'll make a cut and then you'll take that away and you stick it back together again, and then make another cut and stick it back together again, make another cut. So planning the steps of making things is always really important. So this video won't go on too long today, it'll just show you the basics. Now when you're making things like this, it's always handy to work with things. Try not to use sandpaper with just your hand, because if you do that it's very uneven and you tend to make bad edges. So what you want to do is first of all get the right sandpaper. So the two types of sandpaper I've got, Halfords do very good sandpaper and Poundland do sandpaper. The Halfords one has a wider range of the softer gradients, and the Poundland one has the rougher gradients, which are quite good. Now 80 is very rough, and the opposite to that would be 1200, which is very fine. So the bigger the number, the finer the paper, the smaller number, the rougher the paper. And essentially what you really want are around 3 different gradients for doing models. You want something very rough to begin with, to take off all these bad edges. Then you want something that's a bit softer, like a 240, for bringing it down fairly smooth. And then what you want at the end is a 1200 for just bringing up the nice edges. Now I always work with a spotlight just over the top, and the reason being, if you use a spotlight you can actually see the bad edges here. You can see these bad edges in here. You can see all of these edges here where the bandsaw's cut away, and you can see here where the disc sander's been working. Now, so working with the spotlight's really good because you get to understand what your edges are like on the model. Now when you spray your models up and you finish them, that's where all this will show up, and that's the difference between a good model and a bad model. Good models have beautiful finish, bad models have bits like this, and it just makes it look fake, and you want your model to look as realistic as possible. So the finish is most important. So when you're working, what you're best off trying to do is using hard flat surfaces. So for example here I use a ruler, and I folded up a piece of, I think this one is 80, and I slide the ruler in there. And the reason being because the ruler has a sharp edge, which means once you hold the paper flat you can get right into, say, pieces like this here, and it's easier to work. So that's much easier to work with when you've got a flat edge than when you're using your hands. Like that. Much easier, right? That's easy to do. If you're doing it with just your hands, it's very, very hard. Also what you're better off doing is putting double-sided sellotape onto this. I don't have any, so I've just wrapped it around tight. Now the other one would be something like this here, like a piece of plastic, flat. You can get a piece of wood, it doesn't really matter either way, but if you wrap the paper around it well enough, it means you'll be able to work on a flat surface like that. And what you'll start to find is when you're working under the light, the more you work away with these flat surfaces, the better the edges will get. So you start to see when you're working under the light, this edge starts to get nice and crisp, and you'll only get crisp edges from working with things like this. So that's really key, that's very important. Start off with a rough gradient, something like an 80, wear down all these lines so it's starting to get smooth like this, and then move to something slightly lighter, like a 240, and then work again. And it starts to look really nice. Edges start to get better, and then eventually move on to something really light, like something like a 1200, and work away. You can feel how smooth they are when you're working with them. So that's what I would do. This is one I was working on before today, and you can see here this is fairly smooth. It's not quite finished yet, but you can see all these lines here are nice and crisp. Getting edges like this that come down and round and across, you only really get that from using something like that that's flat, because you can put it hard on there and just push until it looks good, and keep working away at it. And the more time you spend working on the surfaces, the better they'll get. So this is just quick for illustration purposes, like this, right? So that's kind of where you want to be. You can start to use tools like files, like this. These ones I use for detail. So if I was working in this here, and I wanted to put small details into things, split lines, where two parts of a product would meet, you'd use files like this. You know, and these are good for taking bulk material off and putting edges on, like this. But they're not good for finishing. These are just good for doing the majority of the graft, the hard work, and then you use your papers to finish. Right, so you should by now have a collection of files. I tend to use these Rolson ones, square ones, straight ones. I've got round ones over there. The other nice thing is with these papers, it doesn't really matter what you use. You can wrap anything with the paper. You know, so if you were doing something that had a round edge to it, like that, and you wanted to make something really, really smooth inside, you could wrap the paper around a pen and work with the pen inside to make a nice curve. So if you want to make good surfaces, use things to take edges from and then cut in with that. Now this is P38, this is what I was talking to you about before. P38 is a filler. So whereas up to this point we've been taking material away by cutting it and sanding it, P38 adds material on. And what you do with P38 is you mix it with this hardener here. So you only need a small amount of this, very, very small amount, to a large amount of this. And I think from what it tells you on the tin, I think it's 2 parts to every 100 of this. So for 2 sort of like P shapes of that, you need 100 of the same in this, right? So I think in all fairness, it's like the size of a pea to a golf ball. But you'll work it out. The more erect stuff you put in, the faster it sets. The less you put in, the slower it sets. So what you want to do is you want to get a bit of this. Now it tends to be quite liquidy and it's quite sort of like a toxic smell, right? But it's good, it's alright, it's not poisonous to breathe it. And what you want to do, if I was going to put, let's say, if I have scratches in here, I can put some of this on and fill this in to get rid of the scratches. And what I want to do is I want to fill in this edge in here and make that round, right? So I've cut this piece out in there like a triangle, but I want to make it round again, right? So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to take a little bit of this P38 and let's have a look. Let's just put a bit in there, like that. That's probably about enough, like this. P38 in there. Right, and you want a little bit of filler, a little bit of hardener. So based on the size that we've got there, I'm probably going to put in a piece which is probably looking to be that. That's probably about enough there, right? About 2 parts to every 100. It's tempting to put more in, but try and reserve not to do it. And you can always buy more hardener when you buy a tin of this, and then you just basically mix it up really well. and then you've probably got about 5 minutes to work with it before it starts to set. Right. Like this. Now you can actually make entire surfaces out of this stuff. If you're making like a nice curved handle, and you can just basically use the filler to make the curved handle if you want. So that's one way of doing it. Right, so I'd say that's probably about right. And then just basically get your finger, just get a little bit like that, and just push it down into the model, into there. So it's quite messy, but it sands beautifully, right? So you'll start to get a feel for how much filler you're putting in. Like that. And it's quite thick, so it doesn't run around too much, which is good. Like that. And you've probably got, like I said, you've got about 5 minutes before it sets. Then you probably want to give it about another 10 minutes to go hard. You can probably start sanding it after around 10 minutes, I would say, something like that. So we put a bit more in there, a bit more. Now, when we come to these edges, you want to make sure the edges get filled up properly on the side of the model. So what you can do is get that Stephen's starting to set now, you can feel it. I think I put a little bit too much red in, but you can get some sellotape, if I can find the edge. Right, and you can put sellotape around the bottom of the model, like this here. That's one side. Bit on here, like that, right, and then that'll give you a bit more space to play with. You can push the filler into that gap, like that. Same goes to here. So you probably need to do this a couple of times to get it right. Like that, and then we'll leave it like that for now and let that set. Now if you've got any bits on other models which are messy, so you can see here for example how this line is here, what you can do is get your filler and you can basically spread the filler onto the model flat on like this using the spatula. And this is why it's called car body filler, because if you're working on a car and you've got a hole in the side of the body panels, you use it to fill it in. And you use the spatula to do it. Right, so instead of me just sanding that away, you can actually use this look just to fill in those gaps and cracks in the model and give it a nice surface like this. Yeah? Like that. Really nice to work with. Easy to sand, really, really good to work with. Probably a little bit toxic to breathe actually after a while, so I think I'll go and have a beer with this and make it nicer. Right, so there we go. Right, that's all good. So this one's setting in here, it's starting to go off now. This one is nearly there, but I'm going to sand those bits down. I've put a bit in the bottom of the curve, this piece around the edge we put on here with the spatula, and if you put some inside, if you want like a radius at the bottom of a circle like this. Right, so I can get some of that and put that in there and just fill in the bottom of that hole. Like that. So you can actually make the bottom of holes nice and smooth, and then you can sand that out when it's set and kind of make it like a little bowl. Bit of practice, bit of time. You probably have to do it a couple of times to get it just right. But yeah, there we go. So that's basic cutting and sanding, and that's a bit of P38 filler. Yeah, and don't forget to put the lid back on that. I don't think it's good to leave it off for long. Good stuff.